Welcome to the Willow Jacket video tutorial. I'm going to be taking you step by step on how to make this jacket right here. This tutorial accompanies the official sewing pattern and the written instructions, and you can find the link to that in the description box below. Via that link you can find out things like the body measurement charts, file choices, fabric requirements, fabric recommendations and all that jazz. I've labelled this sewing pattern level as intermediate, so for me that's someone who has moved away from beginner-friendly projects and can confidently sew patterns with more complex construction techniques. But in the same breath, people who are advanced beginners, so say you might have made 3, 4, 5 plus garments and you're ready to move up a sewing level, I think this could be a great sewing pattern for you. In this sewing pattern you'll be learning how to fully line a jacket, how to add collars, patch pockets, side vents. There's lots of techniques that you can learn here, and I'm going to be holding your hand basically through the whole process. So on that note, let's go through some of the design details for the Willow jacket. And starting with my absolute favourite is the lining sneak peek here at the sleeve opening. I love that you can choose not only a really nice main fabric, but you can also have loads of fun at choosing your lining fabric as well and then wear them on display together. Something I will mention is when you're constructing your jacket, you may try it on. For example, once you've set in the sleeves, you're probably going to slip it on just to see how it's all looking. The sleeves are going to seem excessively long and probably go past your hand. But just keep in mind that the sleeves are designed to be rolled up, so don't be hasty and make any adjustments and thinking this is too long, because you've got to have it rolled up first and then you can make some adjustments later on if you find it's still too long for you. The Willow jacket also features a really nice one-piece collar, which is a really nice shape. The jacket, like I said earlier, is fully lined and we've got these really nice side vents, which I love. And then at the back we have a pleat, which just really adds to that real nice oversized boxy shape, I think. I think it's just a really great basic for everybody to have in their wardrobe, as it's really trans-seasonal as well. It's something that you can wear with layers in winter, or you can also wear it in the spring months with light dresses or light tops. I'm going to put all the timestamps for each step in the description box below, so if you just want to jump to certain steps, you can do that. And if you do have any issues or you just find anything hard to understand, please message me via email, Etsy, Instagram, wherever. I always get back to you basically within the hour. So without further ado, let's get into the good stuff. Please make sure to tag me in your makes on Instagram using the hashtag Willow Jacket, as I always love seeing your makes. It makes my heart very full. Hope you enjoy the tutorial and let me know what you think. We're going to start off by constructing our pocket bags. Now, before you begin, make sure that one layer of each pocket bag has fusible interfacing applied. So the pocket pieces are positioned right sides together, but before we sew around all the edges, we're going to draw in our seam allowances, which is 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, so that we know where our pivot points are at each corner. Along the longest edge of the pocket bag, we're going to be leaving a 13 centimetre or 5-inch opening, as later on we'll use this opening to pull the fabric right side out. Now, before you stitch the 2 layers of the pocket bag together, cut 5 pieces of top stitching thread that are around 15 centimetres or 6 inches long, as we're going to use these to make our corners nice and sharp. So once you're 1 stitch away from your pivot point on your pocket bag, you're going to lift the presser foot and place your top stitching thread in between the 2 layers of fabric and wrap it around the needle. Place the presser foot back down and make 1 stitch. Then lift your presser foot and take both ends of your top stitching thread and place it inside the pocket bag in between the 2 layers. You can then pivot your pocket bag and continue sewing 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch around the edge of your pocket bag. You want to apply the step to each corner if you want to get those nice, sharp, crisp corners. Once you finish stitching, you can snip into your curved seam, as this just helps the seam allowance stay relaxed and move with the curve. Press all the seams around the entire pocket bag open, and then you can run the iron over them to close them and make the seam allowances lie flat, as we're going to be cutting and trimming our seam allowances down. So to enhance the corners of our pocket bag and make sure we get those nice sharp edges, we're going to be cutting down the excess fabric at the corners. So apply this step to all 5 corners. I advise using some smaller embroidery style scissors as you don't want to be cutting or snipping into any of the stitches. Then you can return back to your fabric cutting scissors and trim down the seam allowances to about 1/2 centimetre or 1/4 of an inch around the rest of the pocket bag. Now you can use the unsewn opening to pull your pocket bag right side out. Use a point turner to push into each corner gently so you can get those nice sharp crisp corners. If you don't have a point turner, you can use a blunt pencil. Use the top stitching thread that we attach to each corner to do the extra work of pulling the fabric really nice and sharp. Give the pocket bag another press from the right side so that now we can top stitch around the curved edge of the pocket. Apply the top stitching using a 0.3 centimetre or 1 inch seam allowance. The top stitching should end and begin 0.3 centimetres or 1/8 of an inch inwards from each end of the curve. Use the pocket bag markings on your front bodice to identify where your pocket should be placed. With the interface side of your pocket facing outwards, position your pocket bag on the front right side of your bodice. Stitch around the remaining edges of your pocket bag using a 0.3 centimetre or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, you'll need your back bodice pattern piece, and with the right sides together and the back bodice folded, stitch the pleat in place. The notch on the back bodice pattern piece indicates the width of the pleat and where the seam should start. Where the line ends on the back bodice pattern piece indicates where the back pleat seam should end. I like to insert a pin into my back bodice just so I know where to stop sewing. Once you've sewn your back pleat seam, you can unfold the back bodice so that the wrong side is facing you, and then find the centre of the pleat and press it down flat. You can then turn your back bodice so that the right side is facing you and press the seam again. Now we need to attach the back yoke to the back bodice. With the edges aligned and the right sides together, stitch with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When aligning my back yoke to my back bodice, I like to use the fold line on my back yoke and align that with my back pleat, and then pin and work my way outwards. Before attaching the two pieces, make sure that your pleat is still lying flat and centred. So once you've attached the back yoke to the back bodice, you can then lie the bodice with the wrong sides facing you and press the seam open using plenty of steam. Then you can turn the bodice with the right sides facing you and press the seam again. Now we're going to attach the back bodice to the front bodice pieces, and we're going to align the shoulder seams and the side seams. Remember, on your front bodice pieces, there is a notch at the side seam, which indicates where you should stop sewing. So you should begin your stitch line on your side seams at the underarm and then finish it at the notch. Make sure the right sides are facing and stitch together at the shoulder and side seams using a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you've attached your front and back bodices, you can press all the seams open. Next, we're going to apply a stay stitch around the armholes and the neckline. If you're not familiar with what a stay stitch is, it's just a standard stitch that's sewn through a single layer of fabric, and it will prevent the distortion and stretching of any curves during the construction process. So the next step is constructing the collar. So you should have 2 collar pieces that have been cut on the fold, and 1 layer should have fusible interfacing applied. With the right sides together, align the collar pieces and stitch around the outer edge using a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that I get those nice sharp corners on my collar, I'm applying the same method that I use for the pockets. So I'm first drawing in all my seam allowances so I know where my pivot points are, and I will be cutting 2 pieces of top stitching thread so I can use them to pull my corners outwards once I finish sewing. So again, similar to what we did with the pockets earlier, I'm pressing all my seams open and then running the iron over it to flatten them all again. And then trimming down any excess fabric at my corners using my embroidery scissors, and then using my fabric cutting scissors to trim the seam allowances in half. Now it's time to turn the collar right sides out and use your point turner to shape the corners and use that top stitching thread to really sharpen both those corners. Once you're happy with how the corners look, you can pull that top stitching thread out and then give the seams a good press from the right sides. Next, top stitch around the outer edge of the collar using a 0.5 centimetre or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to attach the collar to the bodice neckline. Now you have a collar notch on your front bodice, which indicates where the collar should start and end. You should also have a notch on your collar, which should align with your shoulder seam. Make sure that the non-interfaced side of your collar is facing outward. So starting from one side of the neckline, I'm starting at my collar notch and positioning it to the end of my collar and working my way around the neckline, making sure both edges are aligned. Once you're happy with the position of your neckline, you're going to attach all 3 layers together using a 0.5 centimeter or 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you're stitching, something to be aware of is when you reach the shoulder seams, the fabric does tend to want to bunch up. So remember to keep lifting up your collar and making sure that all the fabric is lying at flat and the edges are still aligned. So once you've attached the collar to the neckline, this is how it should be looking from the wrong side and the right side. The bodice can be set aside for now as we're going to be constructing our front and back facings. So you should have 2 front facings, 1 back facing cut on the fold and 1 back lower facing cut on the fold. All 4 pieces should have fusible interfacing applied to the wrong side. With the right sides together, you're going to stitch the front and back facings at the shoulder and side seams using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Remember, at the side seams of the facings, similar to how we did with the front and back bodices, you should only sew up until the notch. Essentially, the notch indicates where the seam should end. Once you finish stitching the front and back facings together at the shoulder and side seams, you can press the seams open and flat. Next, we're going to attach the facings to the bodice, making sure all the notches align, for example, the collar notches, and also the shoulder seams on the facing and the bodice should align. The collar should be sandwiched in between the facing and the bodice. The bodice and the facings should be positioned right sides together and attached using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. The following clip will just show you in real time how I'm connecting the facing to the bodice without any cuts, just so you can see how I line all the edges, making sure everything aligns properly. I find it best to align the facing and the bodice at the neckline and then work my way around the body, such as the centre front and the side vents. When you reach the side vents, ensure that the side seams are aligned, and from the notch upwards on your facing, make sure the seam allowance is pressed open and flat, and then the seam allowance below the notch is aligned with the edge. As when you're sewing the side vents, you're actually going to reduce your seam allowance up into the notch and then bring it back out as you pivot away from the notch on the other side. If that sounds a bit confusing, don't worry, I'll take you through the whole thing in the following video. So before you attach the facings, just double check that you've got everything aligned properly with the collar sandwiched in between the bodice and the facings. Again, I'm going to be using some top stitching thread to make my corners nice and crisp as I work my way around the outer edge of the bodice, and I'm attaching the facing to the bodice with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Stitch around your first side vent corner and work your way up to the notch, reducing your seam allowance to almost nothing. As you touch the seam allowance of your side seam facing, pivot your fabric around and work your way back up to a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance, keeping all the fabric flat and aligned. Then pivot your fabric around your second side vent corner and carry on stitching with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then you can repeat that process for your second side vent. Once you finish stitching the facings to the bodice, I like to just go around and make sure no fabric has been bunched up or folded as I've worked my way around the bodice. Next, take your time pressing all the seams so we can get those nice crisp edges. Again, repeating the process as we did for the pocket and the collar, you're going to be cutting the excess fabric away with your embroidery scissors at all the corners. So that's at the centre front and the side vents. I'm then going to go in with my fabric cutting scissors and I'm just going to cut the rest of the seam allowance down around those edges. Avoid cutting your seam allowance too far back around the neckline. I normally avoid this altogether as we'll need the seam allowance for when we're understitching the collar. Now you can turn all your facings to the wrong side of the bodice and using your top stitching thread to get those nice sharp corners again and going in with your point turner just to make sure everything is shaped correctly. Once all your facings are positioned on the inside of the bodice, you can then press the seams again from the right side. Next, we're going to be understitching the collar. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, it's a stitch that's applied to the seam allowance of a garment's lining or facing, and you're securing it to the inner fabric layer. This just prevents it from rolling out when you're wearing the garment. Press the bodice and collar seam allowances away from the facing and stitch only through the facing and the facing seam allowance, not the main bodice. Stitch along the right side of the facing, stitching as close to the neckline seam as possible, beginning and ending the stitch line at the collar notch. Ensure the stitch line only passes through the facing and facing seam allowances. As I move over to my sewing machine, you can see I'm making sure that I'm only going to be stitching through the facing and facing seam allowance. And as I work my way around the neckline, I'm just lifting my facing up and making sure that the collar and bodice seam allowances are away and out of my stitch line, and I'm just sewing on the facing and the facing seam allowance. Make sure to follow the curve of the neckline very carefully and that the stitch line begins at the collar notch and ends at the second collar notch. As you can see in the video, my stitch line is only visible from the facing side and not from the outer bodice. You can set your bodice aside for now as we're going to be moving on to the sleeve construction. So you'll need 2 sleeves with all your notches clipped and 2 sleeve facings. Both of the sleeve facings should have fusible interfacing applied to the wrong side of the fabric. Place the sleeve and sleeve facings right sides together, aligning the notches, and then you can stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. With the wrong sides facing you, press the seam open and flat, and then turn the sleeve with the right sides facing you and press the seam again from the right side. Understitch the sleeve facing from the right side by stitching close to the edge, with the facing seam allowance pressed behind. This is going to keep the facing neatly in place when the sleeves are rolled up. Repeat this process for your second sleeve. With the right sides together, align the long edges of your sleeve, making sure to align your sleeve facing seams and stitch together with a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. With the wrong sides facing you, press the seam open. Then turn the sleeve right side out and press the seam again. Now we need to set the sleeves into the bodice armholes. You should have 3 sets of notches, a single notch for the front sleeve, a single notch for the shoulder notch, and a double notch to indicate the back sleeve. I'm going to begin by setting in my left sleeve to the left armhole. So I'm aligning my front notch to the front notch on my bodice armhole, the sleeve seam to the side seam on my bodice, and the shoulder notch on the sleeve head to the shoulder seam on my bodice, and finally the back notch on my armhole to the back notch on my sleeve head. So I like to put my hand through the armhole and align the side seam on my bodice with the sleeve seam. Remember, we are aligning the right side of the sleeve to the right side of the bodice. I always find this is just the easiest place to start on the armhole. Once you've aligned the seams, you can start working your way around the armhole and aligning all the notches and distributing that fullness. I find for this step it's much easier to use clips, but if you only have pins available, that's also fine. But it's easier with clips as you can just redistribute the fabric really quickly by just unclipping them. As you can see in the video, I'm just showing you in real time how I align my notches and work my way around the sleeve head and the bodice armhole, taking my time just to make sure everything is aligned correctly. Once you're happy with the position of your sleeve and all the notches are aligned, you can head over to your sewing machine and sew the sleeve head into the armhole, right sides together, using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you finish setting in your sleeve, this is how it should look from the wrong side and the right side of the fabric. So you're going to head over to your ironing board and give the seams a really good press from the inside and the outside of the garment. When you're pressing your seams from the wrong side of the garment, make sure to press your seams open and flat. You can then repeat this whole process for your right sleeve and your right armhole. Then once you've set in both sleeves, you can set your main bodice aside for now, as we're going to be working on the lining pieces. Before we start on the box pleat for the back lining bodice, just ensure that you have marked your darts using tailor's chalk or a water-soluble pen, whatever your preference is. Then repeating the process as we did for the main fabric back bodice, you will find a notch that indicates where your box pleat should start, and where the line ends, that's where your box pleat seam should end. Again, I'm just indicating with pins where my pleat should start and end, so I know when I head over to the sewing machine. Once you finish stitching your box pleat into position, you can unfold the back bodice lining and locate the centre of the pleat on the wrong side of the fabric. Press it flat and ensure the pleat lies evenly and smoothly. I then like to turn my back bodice lining with the right side facing me and press the seam again. Now we need to set in the darts, so make sure that the dart legs and the point of the dart are clearly marked on the wrong side of your fabric. Now you can either pinch the fabric from the wrong side of the bodice, or you can turn your fabric so the right sides are together and pin your dart into place that way. Head over to your machine and begin setting in those darts, starting at the wide end and sewing toward the dart tip and then tapering off gradually. Press the dart seam allowance downwards towards the bottom of the garment or the bodice hem, and then turn the fabric so the right side is facing you and press the dart seams again. Now we're going to attach the front bodice lining to the back bodice lining. So place the right sides of the fabric together and stitch together at the shoulder and side seams using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you've finished stitching those seams, you can press the seam allowances open and flat from the wrong side of the fabric. If you're wondering why I'm always requesting you to press your seams open and flat, it's because later on when we're aligning the main bodice to the lining bodice, we're really trying to reduce how much bulk there is at each seam, as the last thing you want is a needle snapping because your seams are just way too bulky. Now we're going to be constructing our sleeve linings. Before you begin, make sure that you've cut your sleeve lining pieces at the correct length, which is indicated on the pattern piece. Repeating the same process as we did for the main fabric sleeves with right sides together and aligning the long edge of the sleeve. So stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And with the right sides facing you, press the seams open and flat, and then turn the sleeves right side out and press the seams again. Now you'll need to set the sleeves into the lining bodice, which is the same sleeve insertion method we used on the main bodice and main sleeve, so you can revisit that part of the video if you need a quick refresher. Once you've set your lining sleeves into your lining bodice, we're then going to attach the lining bodice to the main fabric bodice. Now, if you've never done this before, don't worry, I'm going to hold your hand through the whole thing. So begin by turning your main fabric bodice inside out. Then turn the entire bodice so that the right side of the fabric is facing you, and then you're going to turn all your facings so that the right sides are facing one another. So essentially, the bodice and the facings are going to look how they did in step 10 of the instructions. Some of you may have never done a lining before, so I really want you to see in real time how I'm doing this. So you'll find that there's like minimal cuts throughout these videos, just so it's really clear what I'm doing throughout the steps. Once your main bodice and your facings are all right sides facing, you can then grab your lining bodice and begin aligning it right sides together. Turn your lining bodice inside out, and then you'll want to grab some pins or clips or whatever your preference is. Then we're going to be aligning the right side of the facing to the right side of the lining bodice. I usually like to begin at my shoulder seams, so I'm aligning the shoulder seam on my facing to the shoulder seam on my lining bodice. Once I've aligned my shoulder seams, I start working my way around the front bodice, making sure to align the notches along the facing and lining edges. As you work your way around the front facing and the front lining bodice, you should find that there are 2 notches before you hit the curved corner and 1 notch after you hit the curved corner before the side vents. If you're ever unsure where your notches are positioned or if you've clipped them all, just refer back to your pattern pieces. The most fiddly part about attaching a lining to a main bodice can be the corner section, which I'm just about to reach now. Take your time with this section as it's quite easy for the fabric to bunch up, and we want to make sure that the fabric is laying flat and there's no lumps or bumps and that the edges align properly. Not only are the notches there to help you align everything, you can also use things like the side seams of the bodices to make sure everything is aligning correctly. The following clips will just show me working my way around the entire bodice and working my way back to where I began at that first shoulder point. Once you reach the back facing, you'll want to ensure that your box pleat on your lining bodice is aligned with the centre of your back facing. This is usually indicated by your fold line, which should still kind of be present within the fabric, and you can make sure that those 2 pieces are aligning correctly. Before we attach the main fabric bodice to the lining bodice, we need to make sure we have an opening to pull the fabric right side out later on. So at the back lower facing and the lining hem, make sure you have an opening that's unsewn, which is around 30 centimeters wide or 12 inches wide. Now we're ready to stitch the main bodice to the lining bodice using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance with the right sides together. Once you've stitched the 2 bodices together, this is how your jacket should be looking so far. Just take your time going around all the seams and making sure all the fabric is lying flat and that all your notches align, and especially checking that your corners have not got any lumps or bumps or the fabric hasn't bunched up. Now to fully bag out our lining, we need to align the sleeve facing edge to the edge of the lining sleeve. With right sides together, pin the bottom raw edge of the sleeve lining to the raw edge of the sleeve facing. And when you're aligning both seams, make sure that the seam allowances are lying open and flat. After aligning the sleeve seams, continue around the remaining sleeve opening and carefully matching the edges as you go. Pin all the way around until the sleeve lining and sleeve facing are fully aligned and the sleeve opening is completely enclosed. Once everything is positioned into place, you can head over to your sewing machine and stitch the sleeve facing to the sleeve lining right sides together using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you finish stitching around the entire sleeve opening, you can press the seams and repeat the process for your second sleeve facing and sleeve lining. Now that the main bodice and the lining bodice are fully bagged out, we can use that opening that we left at the back lower facing to pull our jacket right sides out. It's going to look a bit chaotic for a while, but just try and pull everything through, and then once most of your bodice is through, you can start putting your hand through the sleeve opening and pushing everything into place, pulling your collar out. You can even give it a bit of a shake if that helps. And then once everything is pulled to the right side, you can head over to your ironing board and give everything a really good press. Once you've given everything a really good press, we now need to close up that opening that we left at the back lower facing. At this point, I usually like to head back over to my sewing machine and close up that opening as much as I can with my machine first. And then whatever I can't get to, I use a ladder stitch to close it up neatly. Make sure your ladder stitch is only going through your back lower facing and your back bodice lining, as we don't want this visible from the right side of the jacket. So we have very nearly finished the jacket. So next you need to roll up your sleeves by 6 centimeters or 2.5 inches. You can roll them up more or less depending on your preference, it's completely up to you. Now we need to insert 4 buttonholes to the right bodice of our jacket. I like to use a water-soluble pen just to mark out where my buttonholes are going to go. You can also use tailor's chalk or a heat-soluble pen, again, whatever your preference is. The first buttonhole should be positioned 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch from the top edge of the jacket, and the remaining 3 buttonholes should be positioned 12 centimeters or 4 inches and 3/4 apart. Once you've marked your buttonhole openings onto your right front bodice, head over to your sewing machine and select which buttonhole you want. I'm using the buttonhole stitch number 32 on my brother's sewing machine, and it will automatically set my stitch length and stitch width for me. Insert your buttonhole into your buttonhole foot. This is going to tell your sewing machine how long to do your buttonhole opening. Then you can replace your standard foot for your buttonhole foot on your sewing machine. If your sewing machine's buttonhole setup looks completely different to mine, you may want to consult your sewing machine manual for a step-by-step guide. Pull down the lever at the left-hand side of the presser foot, so this tells your sewing machine that you've attached the buttonhole foot. Now, before you do your buttonholes on your jacket, I highly advise that you do some test runs on some scrap pieces of fabric. Make sure you do 2 layers of fabric when you're doing your test so it replicates what it will be like for the final thing. As the last thing anyone wants at this stage is to be unpicking buttonholes. Align the markings on the buttonhole foot with the beginning of your buttonhole marking on the front of your jacket. Buttonholes are usually stitched in a reverse direction, so you want the centre front of the jacket closest to you, and once you press down on the pedal, the buttonhole should begin working backwards. You can let your sewing machine do all the work here as you put your button into your buttonhole foot, so your sewing machine now knows how long to do your buttonhole opening. Once your machine has finished stitching your buttonhole, you can repeat this step for the other 3 buttonhole openings. Once you finish stitching all your buttonholes, we need to cut them open. Place pins just inside the ends of the buttonhole next to the bar tacks. Carefully pierce the centre of the buttonhole fabric with a seam ripper, then slowly cut toward each end until you reach the pins. Once you've opened up the buttonhole on both sides, you can remove the pins and repeat this process for the remaining 3 buttonholes. Now we need to identify where our buttons need to be placed. So the overlap of the jacket is 3 centimeters or 1.1 inches. So I'm using my water-soluble pen just to mark this in place so I know how much my centre front should overlap. Once I'm happy with the overlap and everything's positioned correctly, I'm going to be using my buttonhole openings and my water-soluble pen to make a marking of where my buttons should go. If you don't have a water-soluble pen or any type of fabric pen available, you can also use tailor's chalk to make the markings. Once you're happy with your buttonhole markings, all that's left to do is hand stitch your buttons to the centre front of your jacket using those markings you just made. After I've hand stitched each button to my jacket, I like to just do the jacket up to ensure that it's positioned in the correct place. I really hope you've enjoyed making your willow jacket. Make sure to tag me in your makes on Instagram, as I love to see them. And if you want to see more tutorials like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button below.